I know the day is getting long, but this particular talk in our keynote address series for today is critically important. And this is going to be a review of the regulatory system. So if you think about all of the background that we spoke about today in the medical device sector, between what we heard from Mike Coyle and then what we heard from Justin Klein on the medical device, on the venture side of things, all of that work cannot be done without a clear regulatory path. And we are delighted and honored today to have Blake Wilson. Blake is a regulatory attorney with Hogan Lovells and a multinational law firm that is consistently ranked one of the leaders in the life science sector and FDA regulatory law. Blake his practice focuses primarily on medical device regulatory matters with an emphasis on PMA clearance and approval for new medical devices. Blake has an extensive experience working in the 510K pre-market notification space and pre-market approval applications, as well as de novo reclassifications and so forth. And these are, again, critical areas for new technologies as they move through the pathways of development. Blake, I'm pleased to say, has a University of Pennsylvania connection in that he received his JD from our law school here on campus, along with a certificate in business economics, as well as public policy from the Wharton School. He had obtained his BA from Northeastern University, and with that, I'm very pleased to welcome Blake to our symposia today for a regulatory overview. Thank you, Blake.
End of the day, I know it's tough. But thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for having me here today to speak. And I really appreciate being saved, best for last. What we've heard about today are a lot of technology and innovative designs that are going to be changing healthcare as we know it. Unfortunately, what we need to remember is that as good as our design and our prep work is, it only matters if we're able to get it to patients in our communities. And that's where the FDA regulatory process comes in. So just to give you a slight idea of the breadth of the agency, FDA's responsibilities cover everything from human drugs, vaccines, medical devices, cosmetics, and most food products. And to give a little context, almost 25% of all U.S. consumer spending is spent on FDA-regulated products. For an overview of what I'm going to be going over today, we'll be looking at the organizational structure of FDA and CDRH, what the timelines and costs for approval are, and what is the best strategy for approaching FDA to make sure that we efficiently move through the device clearance or approval process. And also, there have been many updates to the regulations as of late, specifically in light of 21st Century Cures, which was enacted into law in December of 2016, and then just recently FDARA, which is the FDA Reauthorization Act. The Food and Drug Administration is headed by a commissioner for the FDA, and currently that is Scott Gottlieb, who was appointed by the Trump administration. Basically, FDA is unlike other agencies. It has a thin layer of political appointees compared to other government agencies, and we have a large component of career people with strong scientific or medical backgrounds. So this is an overall FDA organizational chart, and the area that we're going to be looking at today is down here. So this is where CBER, CDER, and CDRH lie. Now, normally I would move through this part very quickly as to the organizational structure, but we're having several changes coming up probably in the next 6 months or so that I want to highlight to you. So as I said, the particular offices or centers that we're looking at are CDRH, which is responsible for medical devices, CDER, which is responsible for drugs, and then CBER, which is responsible for biologics. Since today we're focusing on medical devices, This is the general structure. At the top, we have the director of CDRH, who is Jeff Shuren. And then underneath of it, we have our offices, which is basically allocated based on pre and post market. So Office of Compliance is going to be, your inspections, your investigations, basically looking in to make sure that medical device law is being followed. Next to that is our ODE office, which is where you'll actually be submitting pre-market applications to. These are your IDEs for investigational device exemptions, your PMAs, your 510Ks, your de novos. That's where they'll be going and where they'll be reviewed. If we look under ODE, which is on the pre-market side, basically we have a breakdown by treatment area of how these devices are going to be siloed. And so, division of ophthalmic and ear and nose, division of cardiovascular devices, and then underneath each one of these, we'll find specialty panels. And so FDA in their ODE office has 16 specialty panels. Now, what I want you to do is we're going to flip back momentarily to this page, which shows our treatment areas, and then this page. And so underneath all this is where our treatment areas would be. This structure that you see on the board is going to be changing in about 6 months. What FDA is going to be switching to is basically siloing by the treatment area rather than having a post versus pre-market silo. And so you're going to have things like the Office of Cardiovascular Devices, which are going to have all those individual divisions under them, like cardiac diagnostic, circulatory, things of that nature, but they're going to be covering the entire life cycle of the medical device. So your IDs, your pre-market notifications, compliance, manufacturing. And so you'll be going across the board for this. And so this is the new structure that we'll be seeing, and it'll probably be planned rollout in about 6 months. Now, at the end, I did leave a office of blank. And this is because we may have some reorganization going on. For instance, respiratory has been indicated that it may be moving over under the Office of Reproductive, Gastrorenal, and Urological Devices. So we may have some mix-ups in that regard. How is this going to affect people who are submitting applications to the FDA? From an industry perspective, you really shouldn't experience any differences in how you interact with FDA. Pre-market standards of review are going to remain the same. Division directors, who will now be called office directors, should remain the same, although that is still, waiting to see how that shakes out. Jeff Shuren is expected to remain as the head of CDRH. And the offices under CDRH will reflect treatment area, and these offices will, like I said before, manage the entire life cycle of the device. Now, this begs the question of when you do this type of reorganization, does FDA have the resources to be able to put someone who is well acquainted with the compliance laws into each one of these silos? And that's something that FDA is going to have to parse out as they do this reorganization and as they lay it out to the public. Just a little bit more general background about FDA. Has about 15,500 employees. As you can see, most of these are allocated between CDER, ORA, CDRH, and CBER, which the bulk of which goes to CDER and to ORA. And ORA is the Office of Regulatory Affairs, and that is the lead office who is dealing with your inspections, your important review and things of that nature. Many of the people that are in managerial positions at FDA, specifically in these groups, are MDs or PhDs, so they do have strong science and medical backgrounds. FDA obviously employs a host of hard science employees. But one thing I did want to highlight at the bottom here, because of breadth of the scientific disciplines FDA must cover, the agency may not always have in-house expertise in every field of medicine in each center. And the reason that I want to bring this up is, FDA is a very knowledgeable group. They have a lot of expertise in a lot of different areas. But I think, as was demonstrated today, medicine is advancing at a rapid rate. And while you may be the expert in your area, we need to make sure that when we approach FDA, we are not only making sure that we comply with the regulations that they have in place, but we are explaining in detail where we deviate and providing scientific justification for that. Specifically, we've had recent examples of where a company wants to use a different assessment scale for an outcome for a clinical trial where they needed to go back to the literature and find literature and scientific support to assert that that met the appropriate measures for a primary outcome for that specific disease. In this case, I was thinking of Alzheimer's disease. So device regulations. Under CDRH, we regulate medical devices. The pathways to the market are 510K, PMA, HDE, de novo, and we'll be going over these in just a few minutes. FDA has oversight over medical device clinical trials, and there are special product categories as well, which are IVDs and combination products. And this will obviously look a little bit different once we have the restructuring because essentially everything's going to be a special product category now. CDRH also has oversight over radiation emitting products, and this is just part of their original mandate from Congress and from FDA. This slide is, I think, very useful for people that come in and start looking at the regulatory process because it outlines most of the submissions that you're going to be looking at through the product life cycle and when those typically occur. So at the beginning, we have the preclinical testing phase, and we're looking at the types of submissions where you're trying to figure out, am I a medical device? And if I am a medical device, maybe I'm a combination product, and should I be regulated as a device or should I be regulated as a drug or possibly even a biologic? So that's when your 513G request comes into play, which is, am I a medical device? And your RFD comes into play, which is a request for designation, which goes to the Office of Combination Products, which will tell you whether devices or drugs are going to be the ones regulating. From there, you can see we move into the clinical trial phase. Not all submissions require this, but those that do may need to submit an IDE depending on whether it's a significant risk device or not. And typically that is just whether does it have a life-threatening consequence of its use? Is it implanted? Things of that nature. And the requirements are different under each as to what you need to do. From there, once we have our preclinical and clinical testing, we go to our marketing submission. And these, like I've been highlighting, are the different types, the 510K, de novo, PMA, and HDE, which we are going to be going over momentarily. And then after you've submitted your initial marketing submission, usually you go through at least one round of back and forth with FDA where they ask follow-up questions and ask for further clarification or possibly further testing. And if you are on the PMA track, you will also have a day 100 meeting, and then at the end, hopefully you receive your approval or clearance. Now, it's interesting because typically how you start things is at the beginning of the process. When you're looking at the device world, typically we actually don't start at the beginning of the process. We start with the type of marketing submission that you're going to need because that's going to dictate whether you need clinical testing and it's going to dictate whether you need what type of bench testing that you need. And so identifying what type of medical device you are, how you're going to be regulated is very important. So starting out, definition of the device. This is just a simple definition, instrument, apparatus, et cetera, which does not achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action on or within the body and which is not dependent on being metabolized. And obviously this definition is meant to differentiate it from drugs. Any product can become a medical device. All it takes is the intended use. And the intended use is what is going to be our driving force for a medical device. For instance, I think that software is just a very timely type of device that's going out right now. Say you have a software app on your phone and it plays soothing music to you. It's not a medical device at that point. Say it plays soothing music to you and and the advertisement for it is helps you relax. Still not going to be a medical device. Maybe if you made a couple of additional claims, it would get into a slight gray area. But what if all of a sudden you start claiming that it helps with sleep deprivation or it helps, cure some other form of neuroses or treat it or helps reduce anxiety. All of a sudden, this app on your phone, which has not changed in any technical way, has now become a medical device because of the types of claims that you are making. So I think I started this at the beginning, but if you look at the definition, you look at your product and you say, I'm not really sure, maybe I'm a device, maybe I'm not. What you can do at this point is file a 513G petition to seek FDA determination of the regulatory status. However, you should note the decision is non-binding on the agency and the review period may be significant. So even if you go to FDA, they say, come back and say, no, you aren't a medical device, and you start marketing the device, they may come back 6 months later and say, you know what, on second thought, we're actually thinking you are a medical device and we're going to need you to file a 510K for that. So it's very important to note that it is non-binding on the agency when you file these requests under a 513G. In addition, we had also discussed if you're a combination product, should I be regulated under CDRH or should I be regulated under CEDAR, and who should I submit to? Basically, you're going to file your RFD request, which is your request for designation, and you submit that and you submit it to the Office of Combination Products, and then they work through and decide who is going to actually be the one regulating you and who are you going to be reporting to. And we'll go over that in a little bit more detail later on. So the CDRH device classifications. It's a risk-based classification system, and it's assigned by the risk the device presents to potential patients and the level of regulatory control FDA determines is needed to legally market the device. As the risk to the patient increases, classification level and FDA regulatory controls increase. So at our baseline level, we have Class 1 devices, which are subject to general controls. Generally, these are what we call 510K exempt devices, meaning that as long as you're applying the general controls that FDA thinks should apply to basically every medical device, you'll be okay. You don't need to submit a 510K notification. But this is very case specific, depending on the types of claims you're making and the types of technology that you're using. And you have to be very careful about whether you fall into this exemption window. And those will all be in your regulations. Class 2 is special controls, and this is where typically 510K pre-market notifications come into play, and we call them special controls because these are in addition to the general controls that apply to everybody. Special controls are usually identified either in the regulations or in a guidance document for a specific type of device, and so they'll say, this additional type of testing is needed, or you need to comply with this very specific performance standard, or you need to include this type of information in your labeling in order to adequately mitigate the risk. And so this requires doing a lot of research on the front end to understand what is going to be required of the specific claims that you're making. And lastly, we have Class 3 devices, which is our PMA. This is our highest risk level, and these have basically similar filings to what we see on the drug side. Clinical trials are always involved with this one, and these are our high-risk devices. This is just a little bit more explanation because when I talk about general controls and specific controls, people don't necessarily understand what I'm talking about. The general controls are, you have to register with the FDA as a company. You have to say what devices you're going to be putting out onto the market. You need to list the device so that they're able to track it and as well as the person who's putting it out into the marketplace. Quality systems regulations often apply, and those are your manufacturing regulations, and medical device reporting, which basically you need to be reporting when anything bad is happening. Well, not anything bad, but when a life-threatening event occurs or there's a malfunction that could have resulted in a life-threatening event. And these types of things need to be reported to FDA, and everyone does this unless specifically exempted. The special controls, like I said, typically reside in your guidance documents, may require special labeling, mandatory performance standards, or even a post-market surveillance, depending on the type of device. And we're seeing this much more often in the de novo world, where companies are basically writing their own special controls and guidance documents and putting in what is going to be required. So if they have to do a post-market study, you can be pretty sure that they're going to put it into the regulations that a post-market study should also be conducted by everyone after them. Looking at pre-market notification, Class 1 and Class 2 devices gets its name from Section 510K of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The goal of this type of submission is you're demonstrating substantial equivalence to a Class 1 or Class 2 legally marketed device. And basically what you're saying is, you know what, FDA, this is a low-risk device. You've already got some out there on the market. I'm very similar to what this is. I've performed similar testing and bench testing to what the prior companies did. I'm substantially equivalent. We don't need to, go through all the extra data requirements that might be required of a higher risk device. Approximately 4,000 of these are filed every year. About 10 to 15% include clinical data, although this is rising as FDA has begun to require more and more data. Average time it takes to clear a 510K began declining in 2011 for the first time since 2005, and this trend is continuing, and we're going to show you some interesting graphics about where those review times are going. Looking at pre-market approval for Class 3 devices, needs to establish safety and effectiveness. PMAs required that there's not substantially equivalent to a Class 1 or Class 2. Typically requires about 180 days of review time on the FDA side, but typically this is going to take you about a year to actually get PMA approval. Potentially you might be subject to conditions of approval, which is basically FDA comes back at the end of the process and says, we're going to approve you if you comply with these additional conditions. And a lot of times this is a post-market study. Our interesting pathway is the de novo pathway. It was only recently created compared to the other two. It basically started out as a hybrid pathway. What was happening when this didn't exist is someone would have a novel device. It was low risk, so it's not a PMA, and they would have to file a 510K, and even though there was nothing out there on the market that was similar to it, they would have to go through the entire 510K process, get a not equivalent determination, and then go on to get a reclassification afterwards. What basically happens now, no one actually goes through the 510K process first. You're able to do direct de novos now, which this is basically for low to moderate risk devices that have novel technology in them and that there is not a available predicate device, which is what you base substantial equivalent on the market. Currently, there's only been 190 de novo petitions granted by FDA, so the numbers are still pretty low. Approximately half of these instances occur in the IVD space, although the other departments are starting to catch up a little bit on this. So when we look in an easy to see table across the board, what are the different marketing pathways like? Regulatory standard, PMA is your highest, safety and effectiveness. De novo is your middle ground, which is general and special controls, and you provide reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. 510K is your lower end, which is substantial equivalence. Just a little jargon, so you know how to say it. A PMA is approved, a de novo is granted, and a 510K is cleared, just in case you're talking to anyone at FDA. Data standards and data requirements. A PMA is always going to require a clinical trial, typically a pivotal study, obviously. De novo petition or request is going to require slightly less than that, but will require a clinical trial in almost all cases. And then a 510K, some about 10 to 15% have clinical data requirements, but otherwise they perform it through bench testing, animal models, cadaver models, and things of that nature. Just for a little bit of background, confidentiality. For your pending PMA, it's confidential. What's going to go up online afterwards is a summary of safety and effectiveness. Similarly, with the de novo, the pending de novo is confidential, but you'll get an approval letter and you'll have a publicly disclosed decision summary, which is basically going to outline a lot of details about your device. 510K also confidential while pending, and what goes up is a 510K summary, which if you've ever looked at them from what they were 10 years ago to what they are now. 10 years ago, you hardly could tell what the device was when you read one of these because it was maybe 1 page long. Now they're requiring a lot more information. They're about 5 to 6 pages and go into significant detail about what type of testing was used. Just going to jump down to FDA review times. On the FDA side, and these are in FDA days, They have 180 days to review a PMA, 120 days for a de novo, and 90 days for a 510K. And what I mean, and I'll explain this in more detail in a moment, by FDA days is this is when FDA is actively reviewing your submission. At other times when they've given you what's called a request for additional information, that stops the review clock from their side. And then you have time to reply to them, at which point once you submit the reply, this clock starts up again. And they are holding very strictly to the timelines on their side if you don't respond adequately to their questions, because they do not want to go over these because they have to report them to Congress. Labeling requirements, PMA have very extensive labels. De novo is somewhere in the middle, a little bit more moderate. Typically you have to disclose what type of clinical trial data you have. And then 510Ks, substantially less. For an advisory panel, this is almost exclusively done for PMA devices. It's rarely done for de novos. Post-approval studies, typically for PMAs, although we're seeing companies offer it more and more often on the de novo space. And what I'm going to highlight here is a very recent change. This was under the FDARA legislation that was just enacted. And our prices for submitting these have increased substantially. So basically there was a 30% increase across the board on almost all submissions. And the one that really caught people's eye is the new de novo. So de novos used to be free because they wanted to encourage people to file them and they wanted to get the pathway up and moving. They went from $0 to $93,000. So obviously this was a big sticker shock for a lot of people. And we'll be talking a little bit about what type of benefits industry is hoping to extract by paying these prices. 510Ks, this also doubled from what it used to be. And the numbers that are following are what's called the user fee for small businesses. What is a small business? If you have less than $100 million in gross receipts in the last year, you're considered a small business. And you can file as many times as you want using these reduced rates. Additionally, PMAs have another benefit, which is if you're a first-time PMA filer, excuse me, and you have gross receipts of less than $30 million in your last year, you can file your first PMA for free. So I'm bringing up the life cycle again, just to remind everyone where we are. We started out talking about how do we figure out what type of device we are. We may need to file a 513G request or a request for designation. And we're basing this information after figuring out what type of device we are and how we're going to be regulated. And I am going to be flipping to momentarily the IDE portion of this, which I'm just going to go over very briefly. It's the investigational device exemption, generally applies to clinical investigation of devices to determine safety and effectiveness unless they're exempt. Requires IRB oversight and informed consent. Whether or not FDA approves the IDE whether they need to approve it is based on whether it is a significant or non-significant risk device. And interestingly enough, this is a determination that the company makes first. They often go to their IRB and have that confirmed, and then it can go on from there. If you have a disagreement with your IRB, you can sometimes go to FDA and ask them to make a risk determination on your specific clinical trial. So we're going to start looking at review times, and the reason that I will probably be spending a little bit of time on this is because this is honestly where companies start to fall apart, is that they aren't adequately planning for how long things are going to take, and they're basing it off of best case scenario or even off of what is regulatorily required of FDA to review your submission in. You need to be aware of how much time it's going to take and also how you can reduce your time by filing things like pre-submissions where you have early on interactions with FDA. But as you can see, lately, PMA time to approvals have been going down, which is great. We're floating right around the 300-day mark for the last 2 fiscal years that are available, and things are looking okay. In terms of the original PMAs approved, as you can see, the numbers are way up. for the last 3 fiscal years, we're at 95%, 89%, and 94%. And this is probably based off of a lot of pre-submission interactions between FDA and companies. And FDA is working very hard to make sure that they are, getting devices approved that should be approved and using what's called the least burdensome approach. But I want to put this into context. Those were means. This chart reflects the last couple of, I think it's about the last 20 PMAs, original PMAs that were approved. And as you can see, we have a lot in this 300 range, but we also have a lot of outliers. And so these are the ones that you need to be worried about, because you never know if you're going to be the outlier in these situations. And this is something that, investors need to be aware of, clinicians need to be aware of, and, the other stakeholders in the situation. Looking at 510Ks, as you can see, there's a drop-off, in the last couple of years that have been closed out. After that, we start to get a tail-end effect here where we're increasing in the number of days, possibly because of the amount of clinical trial work that's having to be done at this point. Not exactly clear at this moment. But likewise, the number of submissions that are found substantially equivalent is still remaining high. We're floating around that mid-80s range, which is still pretty strong. Again, those were means that I was showing you in terms of the number of days to receiving clearance. There's a lot of variability still, even in 510Ks, and we need to be, like I said, aware of that as we go forward with our submissions. And de novo review times. This is an interesting area because FDA doesn't publish these, so we have to actually put these together ourselves based on what's publicly available online. And as you can see, we're floating right around 300 days for the median and mean here, which actually is very similar to a PMA. And part of the problem is that, in conjunction with FDA not receiving a user fee, they may or may not have been allocating enough manpower in order to get these review times down. Now, in addition to that, these are obviously novel devices. People don't know exactly how to regulate them. There's nothing on the books yet. So, it's not unexpected that the review times would be a little bit higher. But a big industry pushes to try and get these down as more novel technology comes out. And this chart is from 2012 when basically direct de novos became available to present, and you'll see just a ton of variability in how long these types of submissions take. In addition to that, the percent that are being granted are also much lower than you would see for a 510K or a PMA. You're looking more around 50 to 40% recently. And this chart is just to show you that basically at this point, everyone goes direct de novo if they're going to file a de novo. We don't have a situation anymore where you file your 510K, you're found not equivalent, and then you go and file your de novo request. So with our new user fees, which all went up 30% or more, we are supposed to be getting some benefits in terms of our review time and how we interact with FDA. What I included here was what our old, goals were for MDUFA. And these are, percent of submissions that should receive a MDUFA decision, which just means like, a clearance or a, not substantially equivalent determination. And what you'll see is in 2017, basically those numbers are just being imputed here. They're shooting for right around 95%. You can't hope to get much better than that. Where they're going to be focusing is getting the mean down. So they want to reduce the variability over time. So that's what their goal is right now. Similarly with PMAs, we're going to see a similar approach. This is just going to basically be brought up to the next table in terms of what the percent is of submissions that they want to reach a decision by these dates, or by this FDA review time. And what they're going to be focusing on is the total time it takes to get approval, and that's what they're going to be focusing on lowering. Our new addition to this is de novo devices, which didn't used to be reported to FDA in terms of the number of days it was taking and how many grants were being given. Now there is something interesting on this table. I told you earlier that the regulatory requirement is 120 days to get de novo granted. They are basing this off 150 days, and they aren't even giving us very good rates here. We're starting out at 50 and we're going up to 70. So as you can see, FDA believes they have a long way to go with this. So what's our takeaway from this? We need good planning from a business perspective and it needs to address worst case scenarios. For example, it's approximately 300 days for a median direct de novo review time, but there's multiple outliers that are over 600 days. Looking to PMAs, there are several pending right now, although that number is falling, so we're hoping to keep those numbers lower. And typical planning for a novel device, you should expect median FDA review time as a best case scenario. You should not anticipate that's what you're going to get, and roughly double that and you'll be on the safe side. Looking at the pre-submission process, basically what this is FDA's attempt to get people in early, to talk to them, to let them know what they're going on, what type of technology they're planning on submitting, and what is going to need to be provided in order to speed that product through approval or clearance. And so it's a formal submission that gives you informal feedback because none of it's binding. Company must prepare a submission with required information and include concrete proposals. Typically it takes about 90 days to review one of these, and topics that you should talk to them about are your clinical trial that you're planning, the bench testing that you want to use to support a specific claim that you want to make, or if you're going down the 510K pathway, what is my proposed predicate device, and they'll give you some feedback on those items. And again, looking at our chart, pre-submissions are listed here, but basically you can do these at any time, and FDA highly encourages them in order to speed along the process because it makes it a lot easier for them. They know what to expect, and it makes it a lot easier for the company because they know what to expect going into the marketing process. So what types of pre-submissions are there? We have traditional ones, informational meetings, study risk determination, agreement meetings, determination meetings, submission issue meeting requests, and day 100 meetings. The ones that I'm going to focus on just for a second, pre-submission, these are your general pre-submissions. Basically, you write into FDA, you ask them a couple of questions, discrete, and then they give you responses. Informational meetings are a little bit more informal. Basically, what's going to happen is you submit and you're almost talking to them more tangentially and as an idea of what you plan on doing. And FDA is not necessarily going to actually give you a meeting. They might just give you a little bit of feedback, but this is really just to kind of acclimate them to what your ideas are about your product. And then a submission issue meeting request. This actually occurs during your review process. So you filed your submission, FDA came back with a request for additional information, and they have a question about your bench testing, and something that seems very outlandish to you is they're requiring. So you can submit a submission issue meeting request for this one issue and basically say, FDA, we're in the middle of the process. I don't want to hold it up very much. I have one very specific question about the bench testing that you want done, and I would like to propose something different. And so this is meant to really speed along the submission process. Just a couple of highlighted items when you're doing an informational meeting, which I said was the more informal meeting. The purpose is to share information with FDA. It's going to familiarize the review team with what your product is and how you plan to approach the submission. In practice, FDA generally will not provide the same level of specific feedback, which is what I mentioned before, and FDA grants informational meetings as resources allow. So if you file this type of submission, it will be very dependent on what type of response you'll actually get. So the kind of questions you ask, as I was mentioning, biocompatibility questions, bench testing, animal testing questions. For your software, do I have a moderate level of concern? Is that an accurate description of my device? Do I need human factors testing if, for instance, a surgeon's going to be using the device, or if a person's going to be using it? Think of, ultrasound devices that are used to reduce the appearance of wrinkles temporarily. If someone's going to be using the device on themselves, human factors testing may be needed to make sure that they aren't going to injure themselves and they can follow the directions. What not to ask? You can't ask, is this going to get FDA clearance or approval? They aren't going to go into that amount of detail. You can't ask about your specific results from your clinical trial, but you can ask about maybe the study design. Is it appropriate? Am I using the correct primary and secondary endpoints? From a statistical perspective, do you think that I have a sound SAP or not? Looking quickly at combination products, FDA's Office of Combination Products oversees this. And basically what they're doing is they're allocating it, they're taking in your submission and you make a recommendation. You say, I have both a device and a drug in my product. However, I think my primary mode of action is the device and I think I should be regulated by CDRH. You make the submission to OCP and then they will make a determination as to whether they agree with you or not from there. And like I said, what is a combination product? Basically this is based off the primary mode of action, which is the single mode of action of a combination product that provides the most important therapeutic action of the combination product. And there's been a tremendous amount of litigation around this, but fortunately a recent guidance document has cleared up some of it. And the bottom just kind of gives you an outline of how you could be a combination product, either through a device-drug combination or one that involves a biologic. And like I said before, this goes through a request for designation. And these are just a few examples. Combination products that are regulated by CDRH, skin bandages with antimicrobial agents, dental devices with fluoride, ones that have gone over to CBER are transdermal patches or chewing gum for drug delivery, and over to CBER, syringes filled with Rhodea immunoglobulin. So a couple of regulatory updates. 21st Century Cures. This was the big piece of legislation that came out in December 2016. Highlights breakthrough devices. FDA is still trying to find a way to get breakthrough technology through CDRH faster. And so they've consolidated a lot of their programs under the breakthrough devices paradigm, which I'm going to talk about momentarily. And it's largely consistent with the expedited access program, if you're familiar with that. Medical device regulatory process improvements. One thing that industry and actually Congress have both been pushing on is FDA needs to be willing to accept a broader definition of what is valid scientific evidence. And basically FDA had been winnowing this down to, look, we need prospective clinical trials, and what their industry is trying to do at this point is expand it to include, registry studies, human factors testing, post-market studies, and basically to alleviate the need to run so many clinical trials, which are a big detriment to medical device companies, which are a lot of times smaller and on a much tighter bankroll. Least burdensome approach, I think I mentioned this earlier, it's being reinvigorated. This has actually been on the books since '97, but basically it says that FDA, don't ask for more than what you need to verify that this device can be legally marketed, and don't ask for it in a more burdensome way than necessary. And so one interesting thing that, I think a recent guidance has put out is when you're responding to an FDA deficiency where they say we want more bench testing, if you think it's overly burdensome, you can suggest an alternative pathway. You just have to justify it that it'll get the same answer that FDA wants to make sure that this device is safe and effective. Under the humanitarian use devices, recently expanded from 4,000 to 8,000 patients per year, which is a big jump, obviously, but still well what's under humanitarian use devices on the drug side. FDA is going to publish what probable benefit means because HDs have a lower standard than PMAs do. Basically, a PMA, you have to establish efficacy. For a HDE, you establish probable benefit. And so they've never actually clarified what in the world that means. And so we've all taken a lot of stabs at it, but FDA is supposed to weigh in on it this year sometime. And 21st Century Cures also made sure that a lot of the additional, items in humanitarian device exemptions in terms of being able to take in profits or being exempt from user fees for pediatric devices are going to remain in place for the time being. In addition, we had some movement in the health software space. Basically, Congress has been stepping in and saying, look, FDA, we need you to tell us what software is and isn't going to be regulated, and don't make it overly burdensome on industry because we need to make sure that healthcare facilities are able to use the software as needed. Additional provisions that are going to be coming through on 21st Century Cures. Basically, FDA is being told that they need to go through a house cleaning every, so often, especially in terms of the 510K devices and Class 2 devices. After a certain period of time, it's expected that FDA is supposed to say, you know what, we have enough background knowledge on this type of device. We feel very comfortable with the technology. We can move this out of requiring a 510K and bring it down to just requiring special controls. And then more recently, the FDA Reauthorization Act. This included modified device establishment inspections, which is basically going to switch it from a biannual inspection period to a risk-based approach, which is what's on the drug side currently. In addition, FDAR requires FDA to create new process to allow classification of accessory devices separate from the parent. So basically, if you have a device and you have an accessory, even if it was a very low risk accessory, FDA would still classify it as the same risk as the parent device. So you might have a table that goes along with your device, and the table is being classified as a Class 3 PMA device, even though it's really the ultrasound device that's going to be doing the surgical procedure that's the high-risk portion of it. And so this has been put into legislation where FDA now has to have two pathways available where a person can say, okay, our Class 3 device is this accessory device is actually just either a Class 2 or a Class 1 based on the risk associated with it. And then in our pediatric space, FDA must convene a public meeting on pediatric devices. And what they're looking for is how to be able to extrapolate more data from other populations, including adults or other child populations, and increase FDA assistance to manufacturers and identify what barriers are preventing us from getting more pediatric devices to market. How am I doing on time? About 5 more. Okay. So we'll run through the new guidance documents quickly. And this is literally going to say about 15 really significant guidance documents have come out since the summer. And so there's been a lot of movement on FDA's side to make sure that they are implementing aspects of 21st century cures as well as FDARA. And it's been pretty exciting, all the movement that's in the space. And what you're going to be seeing is it's a movement to try being more business friendly, to try being open to taking different types of data and evidence in order to support these marketing decisions, in order to help us get devices to market more quickly, but also to make sure that we aren't overly burdening the business. So two guidance documents that actually just came out, I think 2 days ago, are deciding when to submit a 510K for a software change to an existing device and deciding when to submit a 510K for a change to an existing device. Basically, there are some low-level changes that you can make once you have a 510K clearance that you can, we call it, you make a document to file. And so you document what your change was, but there was no risk associated with it, so you don't need to go back for an FDA clearance for the device again. This helps clarify when you have a software change, what's going to be required for going back to FDA. So for instance, cybersecurity, interestingly, they're actually saying that if you make a cybersecurity related change and it doesn't impact anything else, you can implement it without having to come to us for new clearance. And why this is interesting is because if you are identifying a new cybersecurity area, there's seems to be like an association of risk with that because you're upgrading your technology and you also might be implementing different factors that could affect your cybersecurity. However, FDA really wants to incur cybersecurity action on the part of industry. So they're saying, just go ahead and make it, and you don't need to come for us for the clearance. Acceptance review for de novo classifications. When you file a PMA, a 510K, a de novo, an IDE, we call it comes with what's called an RTA checklist, which is a refuse to accept checklist. And what FDA does is they run down this checklist and they make sure that you're providing all the information that they are going to need. They are reviewing it for substance, but they want to make sure everything is in your submission. And when these RTAs first came out and people started following them, I think it was 2013, the rejection rate for 510Ks was almost 60% on their first time. So people had to then go back, figure out what was wrong with it, and then refile. So the fact that we have one for de novos now means that it needs to be followed meticulously. classification of products as drugs and devices. This is what I was talking about with combination products. And basically, FDA at one point was saying, if in terms of your primary mode of action, if you have any sort of a chemical action that contributes to that primary mode of action, we can regulate you as a drug, and we're going to push you into CEDAR. They went through multiple rounds of cases under, it's called Prever, which is a French company that has been litigating this for years. And finally, Congress has also stepped in and said, FDA, we need you to be more reasonable about this approach. And so FDA recently came out with this guidance document that said when you're looking at the primary intended purpose, a product that has a chemical action could be a device if it does not achieve primary intended purpose through chemical action. And so this is basically saying, you can have your primary mode and therapeutic effect. There could be a chemical component to it, but as long as it's not the driving force behind it, then you can still be regulated as a device, which is a big difference. We looked at breakthrough devices, and then I think I'm running out of time, so I'm actually going to flip to the end to the takeaways. 510K trends. 510Ks with additional information requests on the second round of review has fallen significantly. So this is when FDA gave you a first round of questions, you came back and answered them, and then they came back with a second round of questions. It used to go as many as 3 rounds of questions. In order to get their review times down, they are trying to make sure that they are making these things happen much more quickly. And so we're down to 5% at this point. FDA shows a strong commitment to meeting their MDUFA goals, which is the time frame in which they need to meet clearance. However, these come at a cost. Less opportunity for rounds of interaction with FDA. They're more aggressive about the refuse to accept policies, and they're more aggressive about interactive questioning. And what that is they've started basically asking questions over email rather than submitting them in a formal RAI in order to speed things along a little bit, and they do that for low-level questions.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. Excellent. I think we have... That was quite the regulatory review for sure. Let me ask you 2 quick questions, and then I think maybe our audience has some questions for you, Blake. So one, it's always been thought for a long time that CE Mark was an easier regulatory process for medical device approval. I think the thinking has changed a bit. Your thoughts and perspective on the United States versus CE Mark approval?
Absolutely. I think industry still has the perspective in a lot of instances that the CE mark is a little bit easier to get. But I think in practice, what is actually happening is they are starting to require the same amount of evidence that FDA has traditionally required. And I think this is part of the harmonization efforts that have been taking place between FDA, the EU, Canada, Australia. And so I think we're starting to see that, the review times are taking as long and the review process is becoming much more similar to what it once was, or than what it once was.
Great. You have a number of startup companies and probably young innovators in the audience here. Regulatory is obviously one of the key areas of moving devices through the pathway. You've outlined a lot of information here, but where is the best source for these companies or individuals to try to get an early understanding, even prior to going to the FDA, about what their clinical path, what their regulatory path may be, with their product?
Actually, FDA's website is honestly the best place to start out. There is an incredible amount of information. FDA really does make an attempt to educate industry and stakeholders on what is going to be required and what the process is. The problem, it's so expansive, it's very hard to get a grasp on, what all the little nuances are. But in terms of, you have a product, you think it's low risk, likely a 510K, there's a database for product codes that you can go and look at and find devices that are similar to yours, and a lot of times the product code is referenced to a regulation, which will provide additional information. And then in some cases, it'll also reference a guidance document, which will instruct you on what type of information and evidence the FDA is expecting to see when you file. So effectively going through the different databases that are available on FDA in terms of product codes, the regulations, and guidance documents is really your best approach.
That's great. And one final question. My experience has been that, as is yours, that the FDA is quite open to early dialogue. Is there risk to going to the FDA too early or not?
Very, very rarely would there be a risk. And I always advocate going to the FDA early as possible because basically you want to start a dialogue between you and the agency, and you want to work together, and you want to seem or give the effect that I want to work with you, FDA. I want to make sure that I'm giving you the information that you require, and I'm willing to step up and make those requirements. But and I think FDA starts to reciprocate that as you can make suggestions on maybe they required certain bench testing, and you say, well, maybe we don't have to do quite so many runs, and here's my justification. And FDA will say, okay, well, maybe we could also do something else in addition to that so that, we can bring down the cost a little bit. So early and often interactions with FDA is basically the best approach and the advice that I usually give people.
Great, thanks. Well, we have an expert here, and please, we have a few minutes left. So questions from the audience around the regulatory pathways? Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to know what general perspective you have on the development for approving processes like additive manufacturing and 3D printing and the products that are produced from them through the FDA?
Could you clarify your question just a little bit more as to what specifically?
The FDA was trying to come up with a process to approve types of additive manufacturing and 3D printing machines. They started that a few years ago, and it got moved to the B list, and then it disappeared from their radar. Have you heard anything more on these?
Sorry, can you repeat that question for the people outside?
Oh.
Half the people are outside.
So the question was about 3D printing, and basically, where's FDA on this? The technology has been out there for a while. People are eager to figure out how they're going to get through the regulatory process, but all of a sudden it seems to have been moved into the background. And the reason is, frankly, that it's complicated for FDA to understand how exactly these devices should be regulated, because what ultimately can happen with 3D products is that they may end up in a hospital, and how do you validate each machine in order to make sure that it is meeting the regulatory requirement, as opposed to just a simple software or a device that's being manufactured in one location. In addition to that, you also have the added issue of who is going to be the ones operating it and what type of certification do they need to have, or things of that nature. So I think it's probably gotten pushed back simply because it is not easy, and unfortunately we have not heard a whole lot about it since there was that uptick recently. So unfortunately not a very good response other than that there hasn't been a whole lot of information.
Thank you. Insup?
Recently, FDA announced that they had some agreement with various vendors for some sort of software platform, so you can develop apps without having to go through this rigorous process. Can you clarify what that means?
So I'm not familiar with that aspect, so I'm not going to be able to speak to it too much, but I do know that FDA is making attempts to have basically their own labs where companies would basically, and this works much better in obviously the software space, would be able to go through and run their software through the program, and in terms of whether there's any risks associated with that or hazards, that could be identified simply by running your program through these systems. In addition to that, however, I think that there's also going to be a lot of questions around whether, the types of claims that are being made, and is that going to be reviewed preemptively or aftermarket? And as to whether, this has already been implemented and there's a guidance document available on this or an announcement, I haven't heard that, so unfortunately I can't say.
Insup, was this part of the digital health pathway that
Yeah, they gave certification to 9 companies.
Nine, right.
Certification.
There were some small companies and some large companies, and the idea is basically that if you have a certification, you don't have to come to the FDA with every single software product that you develop, but rather your company is able to release, right?
So under 21st Century Cures, I know that they were trying to implement more third-party review of different aspects. And obviously, like I said, software is going to be one of those areas. And unfortunately, I'm sorry, I can't weigh in more on the companies, but it seems like everyone has, heard about this. So
I think they put that together because they don't have the internal expertise. So they're kind of outsourcing the expertise to these 9 companies, and hopefully it will speed up the pathway for review on the digital side at least. Other questions?
Maybe
that in order to make sure that these things actually happen?
Well, I mean, what FDA is, I'm sorry. So to repeat the question is, FDA has a lot of lofty goals. There are a lot of things that are required of them through the recent legislation. How are they actually going to accomplish this? And I think one of the ways that they're going to do it was by increasing the user fees. In terms of, you get more money, you put more people on staff, and that helps the process a whole lot. So some of it's straightforward, but in addition to that, I think where FDA was sometimes hesitant to reach out to industry and talk to them about, like how would you like to approach this situation? In recent years, we're seeing this much more and more often in terms of laboratory developed tests, in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of software development. And Mark, I think you kind of hit it right on the head. FDA has a broad range of governance that they need to employ, and unfortunately they can't be an expert on everything, and so they have to start outsourcing some of this. And actually the best talent is in industry. It's in the people developing the technology. And so I think a lot of this is going to be about reaching out and fostering that relationship and having less of an adversarial approach and more of a collaborative approach between industry and the FDA.
So I guess to close, Blake, if you had to grade at least the CDRH division of the FDA, what would you give them as a grade?
Oh, I certainly give them high marks. And I would say that because I think that they've been making a lot of efforts to identify the areas where they are lacking and to implement strategies that are going to address that. And I think that identifying barriers has been very important. And one of the areas, and if you had been paying attention when the graphs were on in terms of review time, you saw spikes in the early 2000s or in the around 2010, 2013 in terms of review time. And FDA, granted, after some pushing from Congress, made several concerted efforts to reach out and address a lot of these issues. And in addition to that, I would say that they're also, like I was saying earlier, trying to reach out and work more with industry in terms of how best to regulate these different areas, because the technology is moving so quickly at this point. And I think this interactive approach, which has been much more recent with FDA, is going to be a very good approach to moving them into the future.
Yeah, I think great comments. I've been to 2 meetings over the last just 2 weeks alone where the FDA representatives and Jeff Shern himself has actually been at those meetings trying to collaborate. And this is all due to the pace and change of the technology. So it's a very different, FDA than I think was your parents' FDA or grandparents' FDA, and we'll see where the future takes us. But that was a fabulous review of a very complicated topic. So thank you very much, and hopefully this center and group will have the opportunity to work with you into the future.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for